Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 84, I chat with Stereophile's editor John Atkinson about his recent lecture to the Audio Engineering Society about measurement and perception. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded October 24th, 2011. Episode 84. What is reality? This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or TV instantly. All streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. And by Ford, featuring Wi-Fi connectivity with available sync and My Ford Touch. Now your car can be a Wi-Fi hotspot. Check it out in the new 2012 Ford Focus and at ford.com/technology. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, online editor of hometheater.com. Today's guest geek is John... Sorry, let me do that again. Froggy in the throat there. 3, 2... Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, online editor of hometheater.com. This week's guest geek is John Atkinson, the editor of Stereophile magazine, who just delivered the Richard Heiser Memorial Lecture at AES last weekend, the Audio Engineering Society, due in part to his previous appearance on Home Theater Geeks. Hey, John, welcome back to the show, and congratulations on being invited to give that lecture.
Thanks very much, Scott. It was an honor indeed. I only met Dick Heiser once, but he gave a presentation at the AES in London, which just gave me food for thought for years afterwards.
And some of that food for thought came to fruition this last weekend, eh?
Yes, I developed several ideas which the seed had been planted by Dick 25 years ago. It was an honor to be invited by the AES. I still can't get over it.
Now, before we launch into this, I want to make sure that those who are logged into the live video stream at live.twit.tv or into the chat room at irc.twit.tv, make sure that they know that they can post questions for John, and I will pass along as many as I can. So you started your lecture. I read the lecture, the preprint anyway, and it was very well done. And you started by outlining your education and experience in science and music. And I couldn't help but display here a photo of you from your government ID badge in the late 1960s. Let's see if we can pull that up here. That's JA01 for Burke, our engineer today. And perhaps he can't find it, which is unfortunate because it's...
I've got it.
Okay, here it comes. Because it's really a pretty cool picture. We'll compare that with what you look like today, some, 40 years later, and see that, I guess, as you said in your lecture, long hair was a requirement at that time, right?
For government workers, yes. Oh, gosh, yes, there it is.
Okay.
Yeah, I was working...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was working in a lab on... development of LEDs and semiconductors, a government laboratory, and I used to make my own transistors. I'm probably the only audio magazine editor who ever has done.
Wow, make your own transistors. That's pretty good. I like that.
Yeah,
and yet you said...
Sorry.
I was going to say, and yet you also mentioned in your lecture that most of your experience in audio, anyway, came in the era of tubes.
Oh, yes. When I went to university and when I was at school, the transistor was new. I mean, the germanium transistor had only really been commercially introduced when I was finishing high school. And so all my the circuits I built, including all the logic circuits, multivibrators of various kinds, were all done with tubes. The transistor was a totally new thing. And, yeah, it was a very different world back then. I mean, we had no FFT analyzers. We used to use wave analyzers, which were large tube-powered devices, which you had to look at each harmonic in turn to calculate its level.
Oh, man, it must have taken forever.
It did.
And I have to say, I was struck also by your education and experience combining science and music, which is very much like my own education and experience, and what led me to be a journalist, apparently, like it did you. And a lot of people are surprised by that when I say, oh, yeah, well, I've got a degree in physics and I'm a musician. They go, really? How do those fit together? Well, they fit together pretty well, don't they?
I think so. I mean, I was an academic overachiever in the sciences at school, but I also loved music. I played violin in the orchestra, and under the English educational system, you had to choose. You couldn't do both. So, you know, I pleased my parents by going the academic route, got a bachelor's degree in physics and chemistry, ended up working in a government lab, but music was my passion, continued to be my passion. I, you know, played in bands all the way through university, basically to earn money. And 1972, I got an offer out of the blue to join a band, touring. We were going to make an album. So I resigned from the lab and never looked back.
Well, and now that led you to being an audio journalist, where, in fact, I think you can combine your science and music in a very fruitful way, looking at electronics, looking at how sound is recorded and reproduced, which is really sort of the subject of your lecture.
That's correct. I mean, I worked as a professional musician for 4 years, and at the end of that time, while I was having a great life, making a lot of recordings, touring, TV, radio, I wasn't making any money. So my then wife saw an ad for Hi-Fi News magazine. They wanted an editorial assistant, and I'd been a reader of Hi-Fi News, and went for an interview and got the job, and it all fell into place. An audio magazine was about music, was about recording, was about audio engineering, was about playback, and I could write because that's one thing, a skill I learned at university. So at that point, 1976, 35 years ago, it all fell into place. Both halves of my brain came together, I suppose you could say.
It's a good way to put it, I think, yeah. Now, the title of your lecture is Where Did the Negative Frequencies Go? What the heck do you mean by that?
Well, it was a bit cheeky. I wanted a title which, although the subject is serious, I wanted something that would catch people's attention. And one of the things you do in mathematics is you very often get what's called a complex solution to a formula or an equation. You have both real and imaginary parts. And the same applies when you're doing Fourier analysis to look at audio signals. And you tend to look only at the positive frequencies, the real frequencies. You extract the real solution. But those negative frequencies are still there, and there will be circumstances where they trip you up. For example, in cinema and video, you're sampling the picture at 24 frames per second of film, 30 frames per second in video, and you can get those negative frequencies, making their appearance. Everybody knows where you have a Western, where the wagon wheels go the wrong way round. And that's because you have a negative frequency, a negative angular frequency. The wheels are rotating in the wrong direction.
Now, you don't mean complex in terms of the opposite of simple. You mean
mathematically complex.
A mathematically complex, which involves real numbers, the numbers we're familiar with, and what are called imaginary numbers, which involve the square root of -1.
That's correct.
Which is very strange in and of itself, and we won't go much farther than that. But in mathematics, you often do come up with these complex solutions, and very often you just throw away the imaginary part. And then this relates to certain types of analyses of audio that you were explaining.
That's correct. And I gave an example of video or movies where everyone's familiar with wagon wheels going backwards in a movie, a Western. And that's an example of the imaginary part making its appearance. You have negative frequencies there. the wheel is rotating with a negative frequency.
Now, that is backwards.
Indeed.
Which it really isn't, but it looks like it when you look at the video, which is being sampled, essentially, at 24 frames per second.
Right. And in the audio, in digital audio, this is something you have to be very aware of, as we will talk about later.
Exactly. Very good. Okay, so let's see. Oh, I know what it was. The main issue that I think you would, certainly one of the main issues you address in your lecture is the difference between audio measurement and audio perception. Now, there are plenty of examples of people claiming to be able to hear things that can't be measured. Why don't you give us an overview of this particular problem?
To backtrack a little, I examine in my lecture in some depth how we perceive audio and video, how we perceive sounds and sights. Mm-hmm. I don't think many people have thought about it. I think they assume that the eyes are like a camera, the ears are like a microphone, and that's pretty much it. But actually, that isn't true at all. Your ears and your eyes are hooked up to this really powerful computer, a computer optimized by evolution for recognizing patterns out of basically incomplete data. And therefore, just by looking at a simplistic view of the ears and eyes as mics and cameras will mislead you about what you people can actually perceive. I gave an example of this ability of the brain to form models from the input of the senses at the lecture. I played a 1 kilohertz sine wave tone to everybody, which is a sound every engineer is familiar with. Mm-hmm. I then asked them to imagine that tone. And I would bet that if you did like a PET scan of their brains, there would be no significant difference between what is called the real sound and the imaginary sound. They are both models constructed by the brain, in the first place, using sensory input, in the second place, with no input at all. And I mean, this is why conductors don't have good hi-fi systems. They read the score, they actually hear the orchestra.
You know, this is fascinating. It's certainly something I've read a lot about in terms of what is reality from the philosophical point of view. You know, is there actually an out there, or is it all in your head, being constructed moment to moment?
The answer is it's all in your head. I mean, there was a great. As I was preparing the lecture, my wife and I went to see the new Harry Potter movie. And halfway through, I grabbed my iPhone and started scrolling notes because there was this great quote. Harry Potter sees the ghost of Professor Albus Dumbledore. Right. And he said he's totally confused because surely Dumbledore is dead. And he said, Professor Dumbledore, is this real? And Professor Dumbledore says, or is it in my head? And Dumbledore replies, just because it's all in your head, Harry Potter, doesn't mean it isn't real. And I thought, well, that's my lecture right there. And but my point is that our brain is constructing internal models from sensory information mostly, but also from our cultural expectations, our experience, our knowledge, and we have to look at measuring audio equipment in the light of those models, not in the light of the qualities of the pressure waves that are reaching our ears. It's like the old philosophical conundrum. If a tree falls in the forest with no one to hear it, does it make a sound? And the answer, of course, is no, it doesn't. Because without anyone there to perceive it, there is nothing that we can acknowledge as being sound. The tree creates pressure waves in the air, obviously, but there needs to be a sentient being there for there to be what we call sound.
So one of the catchphrases from the lecture is, to thine own ears be true.
Yes, we need
to take into consideration more, I think what you're saying, than just what we can measure.
Yes, I mean, the reason I came up with that phrase was that when you report what you hear, you have to try and work through the but you have to analyze what is actually reaching your ears and what is a result of your cultural expectations. And I gave an example in the lecture from my own recent experience. I change equipment in and out of my system all the time. And I'd set up a new D2A processor and put on an orchestral recording and was sitting there. And I thought, well, something's not quite right. Yes, the violins are on the left, but they're very unstable. The double basses are on the right where they should be, but it's kind of, I can't really focus on them. And then it suddenly twigged. I got the channels reversed. And the minute I realized that, everything snapped into focus. The violins went from being kind of fuzzy on the left to being solid on the right. It was my realization that triggered the perception, not the other way round. And a lot of examples we have in audio are forcing ourselves to, through that cognitive dissonance, to realize what it is that's actually reaching our ears.
This reminds me something of quantum mechanics, where the observer actually determines the outcome of the experiment.
Oh, absolutely. I gave an example, but this was a perceptual test that I took part in, 28 years ago. I was visiting an engineer called Bob Berkowitz at Acoustic Research in Boston, and we were discussing perception. And he said, let me subject you to a test. So he sat me in a completely darkened room where there was a flashing red light on the left. Now, this is what he did. I didn't know it at the time. I'm in a dark room. There's a flashing red light on my left. At some arbitrary point, the light on the left turns off and is replaced by a similarly flashing light on the right. Now, what did I perceive? The answer is not a flashing red light on the left and then a flashing red light on the right. What I perceived was a flashing red light on the left, but at some point slowly moved across the stage and ended up on the right. So the model I had created in my brain, dark room, flashing red light on the left, now it's receiving new data. The light is now on the right, but the model, the brain is only reluctantly incorporating those new data into the model I constructed. It was a moment of satori that, what I experienced was nothing like what was happening in the world outside.
Yeah, it's amazing. That example is quite amazing. I hope to have a chance to experience that for myself one day. Although,
of course, now I've told you what it is.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Now that I know what to expect, it would probably shift immediately.
Yeah, one of the big problems in blind testing is you're having to cope with the fact the listeners know they're in a test, and results of the previous trial are still going to be there when they take the next trial. What you need is a mind wipe between each trial, except then what would you do with all the zombies you created?
I had a diagram, or rather a chart I wanted to show here, which you had in your lecture, which sort of identifies the difference between parameters that you can measure and perceptions that you might experience while listening to music. I don't know if it's not so easily readable on the screen, unfortunately.
I can see it fine.
Yeah, but there is not a one-to-one correspondence at all between the measurable parameters and the perceivable traits or qualities of the sound, which just goes to show that not everything that we perceive is measurable, and yet...
Well, yeah. I mean, the point is, on the left are sound quality judgments. Now, what are these? These are the listeners describing the quality of the perceptual models being created by their brain.
Mm-hmm.
On the right are measurements that I perform, and they are almost all two-dimensional measurements. They are plotting voltage versus time or voltage versus frequency. And these are aspects of the pressure waves that are reaching the ears. So you have right there a disconnect. On the left are qualities of perceptual models. On the right are two- or three-dimensional measurements of what we would call sound. But the sound itself is multidimensional. And I mean, let me give an example. Let's say we have a listener and you play him a sound and he says, oh, there's too much bass. Well, it could have too much bass because the frequency response has a bump in the bass. It could have too much bass because there's an excessive second harmonic distortion in the bass. Or it could be, say, a reflex loudspeaker with a grossly underdamped woofer, which is ringing like a low-frequency bell all the time. So all three of those things will contribute to the listener's model as having, oh, there's too much bass there. And you can apply that to every aspect of audio.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, and there's no way to know which of those particular possibilities you just mentioned is in fact happening. You could do some measurements, I suppose, but you still wouldn't have the whole picture.
No, and I mean, Dick Heiser also touched on this back in the 80s, that one of the problems with measurements is that every measurement we do is mono. It's done on one channel at a time.
Good point.
We listen in stereo. Now, there are certain aspects of sound, of the things that equipment does wrong, which will actually, the artifacts will come from a different place in the soundstage. So you have, he called it directional unmasking. The acoustic object you create appears to come from, say, the left, but the distortion will appear to come from somewhere a little closer to the center. So instead of being masked by the signal, now it's there in all its glory. And then also, Heiser talked about the higher order constructs of your models. I mean, not only is there the models of the sound you create, there's the music, the second order model, which is the musical message. And then you have even higher abstracts, such as, and Heiser described this as, you know, any music student can compose a piece of music which sounds like it was written by Chopin or Bach or Beethoven. But that Chopin-ness is something we all recognize, but it's like a third order construct. There's no way of measuring the two channels of audio information to say, oh yes, that sounds like Chopin.
Not until we get true artificial intelligence anyway, which is a whole nother question.
Indeed.
There was one example you gave about perception versus something perceived that couldn't be measured that I really want to make sure we touch upon, and that is demagnetizing LPs. Now, we're talking vinyl LPs here.
Yes.
Which shouldn't have any magnetic properties to begin with, and yet you have a great story to tell about this.
Well, I mean, this has been a fad the last couple of years. Wow, I demagnetized my LP and it sounded better. But as you say, Scott, there isn't anything really in an LP that could respond to being demagnetized. So I just put stuff like that to one side. You know, I'll think about it when I have time, which might probably be never. But my assistant Stephen and I were visiting Michael Fremer, and I was going to measure speakers in Michael's room. Stephen was sitting in the listening room with Michael listening to music. So I'm out in the vestibule, setting up my computer, setting up my mic preamps, etc. And Michael plays Stephen an LP track. I forget who it was. I think maybe in Diana Krall. And so I'm still busying away, laying wires. I'm not in the room. And then Michael plays the same music again. And I thought, well, that's got a lot more bass. I wonder what he did. So I yelled out, so Michael, was that a different pressing? He said, no, I demagnetized it. The same LP. And I thought, well, good grief, you know. there's something going on there. So I thought about what's happening here. The first is demagnetizing affects the LP. There is something in an LP which responds to a decaying AC magnetic field. Second hypothesis, when you play an LP twice, it will sound better the second time through something like the fact the deformed groove hasn't fully sprung back into position. The third, the difference I heard was entirely in my brain. The second glass of wine will never taste the same as the first, and the sixth glass of wine will never taste the same as the second. So there are you have three hypotheses to describe that situation. I have no idea which is correct.
Can you conceive of any way to determine?
Well, if I had time, I suppose
This is one of those things to, This is one of those things to put on the back burner for now.
Yes, you can get a Benjamin tape head demagnetizer, a bulk tape demagnetizer for $50. So, you don't really have to spend a lot of money to check it out. I mean, what puzzled me was the reaction on the internet when I wrote about this was, first, people said, there are two facts here. Michael played the record twice, demagnetizing it in between. I heard a difference. So I reported that I heard a difference, and skeptics said, no, you didn't, except I did. Then they said, well, there's nothing in an LP to be demagnetized. Michael and I looked into this, and actually the black color of LPs comes from carbon black, which is very often contaminated with iron dust. So certainly something can be demagnetized, but I have no idea why that would have an effect. And the third thing is, as I said, maybe it's a perceptual thing, but if you hear the same music twice, you'll prefer it the second time.
One way that comes to mind immediately is to just do that test. Play a piece of music, the same source, the same track, everything twice, and see if you perceive a difference.
Yeah. Well, when we do listening tests, we try to defeat that by doing, instead of A-B, doing A-B-A, so that, if you play A and then B, there will be a tendency for people to hear B as better. So if you play A again, and it sounds better still, then yes, the listener is listening to his preconceptions, not what is actually reaching his ears.
Mm-hmm. Burke in the chat room asks, what about static? Certainly LPs generate some static electricity on them. You can sort of feel it. Maybe that has something to do with it.
Maybe. If you take it off, put it back, there's different static. If it's really strong, then the tracking force will be affected. So, yeah, there's plenty of, there are many hypotheses why you can think, well, why would people hear a difference? But
right. It's absolutely fascinating, and we're going to continue our discussion in just a moment. But first, I'd like to thank one of our sponsors for this episode, which is Netflix. Netflix streams thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to you instantly, which means you save time, money, and hassle. There are several easy ways to instantly access these streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. Of course, you can watch them on your TV with TVs with enabled apps, Blu-ray players. You can watch them on your computer, Mac, PC, even iPad or iPhone. If you have a gaming console, you can watch them from there. Just about anywhere, anything you have in your house that's, if it's less than a year or two old, probably has Netflix streaming on it. Apple TV, of course, or Roku. You can watch all these devices, and you can get to Netflix and watch these TV shows and movies instantly right on that device. You can even start on one device and end on another. Whichever way you choose to access Netflix, you can watch them all instantly with no late fees or any hassle whatsoever, anytime you want. And you can cancel anytime you want. So Netflix is kind enough to provide Twit listeners and viewers with this free 30-day trial. You can go to netflix.com/twit and sign up and check it out for yourself, which we here at Twit always encourage you to do. So we thank Netflix very much for their support of the Twit network, and we hope you enjoy watching this all the streaming content on Netflix. So, John, this whole idea of what is reality and internal maps, another aspect of this that I found fascinating was the difference between live performance and recorded music. You did a test once that was fascinating to me, and I'd love for you to explain it to our audience.
Yes, I was asked to take part in a live versus recorded dem in Maryland a couple of years back. And there were two pianists playing a beautifully prepared Steinway D, a 9-foot grand piano.
Beautiful piano.
Yeah. So the plan was the two pianists would play a recital. There was things like Mussorgsky's Pictures and Exhibition, Ravel's Scarbo, some Bach. I would record it, And then in the same room would be a hi-fi system, a pair of vivid speakers, some tube amps, some very high quality D to A converters. And so I recorded the piano at 24 bits and 96 kilohertz sample rate. Then I put the mics much closer to the piano than I would have done otherwise, because otherwise when the recording was played back, you'd get the room acoustic twice. You don't want that. That'll affect the sound dreadfully.
Yeah,
so,
you'll get it in the recording, and you'll get it also from the room again.
That's correct. So all went to plan. All went to plan. The two pianists played for about an hour. I recorded it. We had a break for wine, and then I played back the recording in the same room. I matched sound pressure levels. The system had enough dynamic range and was neutral enough to actually get the sound of the piano correct. But the listeners, while they really enjoyed it, said the playback didn't get the bigness of the piano right. And I wondered for a long time, I thought, well, what do they mean by that? I mean, yes, a piano excites the room differently from a pair of loudspeakers, but the sound pressure was right, the tonal quality was right, but the sheer, I suppose, magnificence of the sound wasn't sufficient. I wondered about that. What was missing in the recording?
Yeah. Perhaps it was the playback. One of the things you mentioned in your lecture is how people often express a strong preference for what are called panel speakers, electrostatics,
yes.
magneplanar speakers, which are these big flat membranes that all vibrate together rather than relatively small cones and domes and things that act like point sources.
Yeah. Well, one point I thought about was about that size of the speaker. A piano is a big sound source. So even though it's loud, the unit of sound pressure per unit area is quite small. And that's called the intensity of the sound. Now, if you play that piano through a speaker with a 6-inch woofer, you're cramming that same sound pressure level through this tiny diaphragm. The intensity is going to be completely different from the real thing. With a big panel speaker, it may be that it's because the intensity is closer to that of a big source, like a piano or an orchestra. On the other hand, you take a flute or a solo violin, the big panel speaker is going to be all wrong, whereas the small speaker will probably do better. And there's something Meridian's Bob Stewart once told me. He said there's something quite magic about a loudspeaker which has the same width as a human head when it comes to reproducing vocals. I wonder if that's the same thing. You're hearing the sound of a voice coming from a speaker which is the same size as a human head.
And I think you also said that panel speakers and horn speakers too, which we haven't been talking about yet, often don't measure very well. And yet people still...
Yeah,
Sorry,
when you
go ahead.
measure a panel, when you measure a panel speaker, I mean, the fundamental assumption you make when you measure a speaker is that you're a long way away from it, which means several times its largest dimension is wrong because it's big. You're always going to be in what's called the near field, which will boost the bass up. The second thing is the impulse response of panel speakers looks terrible. It's very hashy compared with the very clean impulse you get from a regular speaker. And I haven't decided what that means. Is it hashy because it's a bad impulse response? Or is it hashy because the speaker is behaving fundamentally differently? And if you think about a large panel speaker driven electromagnetically or electrostatically, the average position of the diaphragm is going to move in response to the driving signal. But if you look at the individual elements of that diaphragm, of that big panel, they're going to, in effect, shimmer. The average position moves correctly, but each individual element is going to be catching up or falling behind. And you're going to get this sort of shimmering effect. And that's kind of what you see on the measured impulse response, this hashiness. And it's something that needs further investigation. But this thought was triggered some years ago by I was at a lecture given by the mathematician, the late Manfred Schroeder, and he said, he was talking about chaotic systems in audio. Chaotic meaning mathematically chaotic.
Right.
And he said one indicator of chaotic behavior is the production of subharmonics, which means, you know, normal harmonics are 2 times the frequency, 3 times the frequency, 4 times the frequency. We call that distortion.
Mm-hmm.
But a subharmonic is a fraction. And I got home, I was measuring a panel speaker, put in a 1 kilohertz tone, and to my surprise, got out a 500 hertz tone, as well as the 1 kilohertz. So then I thought, well, maybe that's what's going on. It's behaving chaotically, which means, again, the individual elements of a panel are sort of shimmering as the panel moves.
Mm. Another example that I found fascinating in your lecture was digital to analog converters, or DACs.
Yeah.
We have a couple of charts here to put up and show you. One is from a pretty standard DAC with what's called a reconstruction filter.
All DACs have a reconstruction filter, but they can vary enormously in how they're implemented.
Exactly. And I think one of the basic parameters that you talked about was whether or not they oversample.
Yes.
Am I correct about that?
The filter in a DAC actually reconstructs the analog signal, but it's a low-pass filter. It gets rid of all the images of the sound, all the negative frequencies, as it were,
mm-hmm.
which are clustered around the sample frequency and all its harmonics. But it also perfectly reconstructs the signal below half the sample rate, a frequency that's called the Nyquist frequency. It's a beautifully elegant way of a beautiful example of audio engineering done right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you do that, as I said, you get perfect reconstruction. But what happens if you have no filter? If you just let that stream of ultrasonic information with all the negative frequencies there in their glory through to the output of the DAC? What's been puzzling me a lot in recent years is if you play people a conventional DAC or what's called a non-oversampling DAC, which has no filter at all, and they don't know anything about the technology or what they're supposed to like, they tend to prefer the non-oversampling DAC.
Now we have a diagram here, a chart. I hope we can pull up JA03. Okay, that's go ahead. Tell us what this is.
Yes, this is a totally conventional high-performance D2A converter, and I fed into it 2 tones at 19 and 20 kilohertz. Those are the 2 very tall spikes at 20K and just below. And you can see to the right at the 25K line, those are the remnants of the negative frequencies that have been removed by the filter. And then lower in frequency, you have some intermodulation products, but they're very low in level. This is a superb measuring conventional D2A converter.
Mm-hmm. But then if we look at the non-oversampling DAC, which is the next one, JA04, we will see something very, very different, which I hope we can pull up here because there it is.
There it is.
Oh, my God, look at that.
You can see again the 19 and 20 kilohertz tones, but then almost at the same level are the negative frequencies folded down from the sample rate at what? That would be 24.1, 25.1 and 26 and 24.1 kilohertz. But also you see this mess of aliasing products and intermodulation products all throughout the audio band. I mean, this is awful, really awful. So when people say they prefer a DAC which measures like that to the previous DAC, which measured so well, what are they listening to? It's a mystery to.
Still a mystery, eh?
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts on that. The one thing you get from a DAC which has no reconstruction filter whatsoever, other than sometimes a completely blown up amplifier because it can't deal with the ultrasonic energy, is you get very good time domain response from it. You get an impulse out of it which looks like an impulse, a single sample high.
I think that's JA05 if we have that to pull up. I think we do. Let's see if we can pull that up and see. Now, an impulse, while we're looking for that, the impulse response, okay, here's the impulse response of the non-oversampling DAC. And an impulse response is really, you feed it a momentary signal, right? Just a very, very short pulse.
A single sample pulse is what I use to generate that graph. And because you have all this ultrasonic energy, but all the positive and negative frequencies going up basically to infinity, to light, it all cancels any ringing and pre-ringing on the filter. So you're left with just this single pulse, just a little bit of overshoot. I mean, that's a very good impulse response. You don't get that from a normal D2A converter or CD player.
Right. If we look at the next graph, we'll see the impulse response from the other DAC we were looking at, which measured so well, and yet its impulse response doesn't look so good.
No, what you're getting is ringing before the event. So you have the impulse just before the 3 millisecond line, but you can see that the DAC is starting to ring, builds up to the impulse, and then fades away. It's completely symmetrical in time. It's called a finite impulse response filter or a half-band filter. And this is actually, almost all CD players and DACs use this kind of filter. It's a very well-studied design. And
now, how can it start ringing before it gets the impulse? Wait a minute. Before we get any further, I got to ask this question.
Well, it's not prescient. If you think about it, the real start of the impulse is away to the left of the graph. And what you're doing is delaying the arrival of the impulse by the time that the filter is taking to calculate the result. So it's basically, you know, it really isn't prescient. It's just the fact that it takes a certain amount of time to calculate the impulse response. And the filter is doing that. And it actually reconstructs the analog signal by doing what's called convolving the data with that impulse response. So it's not prescient.
Okay, but you were about to make a point when I interrupted you with making sure that it wasn't prescient. Please continue.
The complete mystery to me is that, like video, where I said, you know, you create this model and it takes a certain amount of time to be created. In fact, what astonished me when I'm researching this is the brain takes about 1/10 of a second to construct its model, which means we experience the world 1/10 of a second as it was in the past, which is extraordinary if you think about it.
Yeah, indeed.
And the same thing is true in audio. It's not 1/10 of a second. But basically the brain cannot distinguish anything that happens within about a 10 millisecond window. I think it's 10.
I believe for audio it is 10 milliseconds, yes.
Yeah, which means you get this astonishing fact that if you get a loud sound, if you get a very quiet sound, which is followed within 10 milliseconds by a very loud sound, you won't hear the quiet sound at all, even though it occurred before. That's called backward masking. It's extremely unusual. It shows the evidence. It's the evidence for the fact the brain needs time to calculate the information it receives from the ears. Now, the difference between those two impulse responses, the non-oversampling DAC response and the conventional response, is well beneath that integration time. So why should there be any audible difference between the two? I don't know the answer.
So they're well under 10 milliseconds in width.
Yeah. So as far as I believe conventional theory suggests, they should sound identical. So in other words, you have compromised the intermodulation performance, the aliasing performance of the DAC by dispensing with the filter. You've let all those negative frequencies mess everything up to gain an advantage in the impulse response, which is never going to be audible anyway. A mystery.
And yet people tend to clearly express a preference for the sound of that non-oversampling DAC.
Yeah. So yes, they do. So is it that the non-oversampling DAC is giving them information that allows them to create internal models more efficiently? Is it just they like the sound of all that distortion? I really don't know.
This whole notion of internal maps is absolutely fascinating to me. You gave us a couple of examples. One was your left-right channel reversal, and you didn't hear it as that until you realized that that's what was going on.
That's right.
The flashing light test is another one. One that's always fascinated me is when Edison first developed his phonograph, the recording system, and people listened to it, they claimed it was indistinguishable from live. Now, if we were to listen to those, old wax cylinders and whatever today, we'd say, no way. There's no way that could possibly be indistinguishable from live. And yet they claimed it was in those days.
Yeah, I think this demonstrates the fact that you can only construct acoustic models from the information you already have. If you're presented with something completely novel, it doesn't fit. And it isn't that you hear the sound and you don't recognize it. It's that you don't hear the sound at all. So when you had one of those Edison demonstrations where Anna Case, the soprano, was singing against the phonograph, yeah, the people, they weren't dumb or deaf. They had no way of constructing an internal model of the phonograph sound that would allow them to differentiate between that model and the model of the soprano's actual sound. It's and this has been experiments have been done like this many times over the years, that you have to learn something before you can actually perceive it, which is a paradox if you think about it. I think, isn't there some visual equivalent in natives seeing Westerners in ships for the first time?
Yes, exactly. I've heard it said that the Mesoamerican natives, when Cortez first arrived, couldn't see the ships because they'd never seen sailing ships like that before, so they couldn't actually, in fact, see them on the horizon. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I have heard that as a conjecture, at least.
Yeah, and as I said, you can only construct models from what you already know. So with novel data, you just can't identify what is going on. And it's not, as I said, it's not that you see it and don't understand it. You just don't see it or hear it.
Well, F-Loop in the chat room asks a related question here, which is, has the many, many hours of stereo listening that reviewers engage in caused their brains to change to such a degree that their perceptual experience no longer correlates to the perception of a new listener?
I'm sure that's right. I'm sure that, you have the princess and the pea syndrome, the princess who could still feel the pea through 15 mattresses and still couldn't get any sleep. I think reviewers have that going on. It not just reviewers. When I visited Acoustic Research in the trip I mentioned, they had a woman on the tweeter assembly line was rejecting tweeters for 0.05% of distortion. She'd got, she would be listening to tweeters. The idea was if they had less than 1%, then they would pass.
Right.
She was starting to reject tweeters, which had a 20th of that amount, because she got so used to the sound she was supposed to be listening to, and the slightest aberration popped out. So yeah, there's always a learning effect going on. A quick sidebar here. One thing that came out of the AES convention, there was a fantastic paper on Friday night before my lecture on human hearing and hearing loss. And it turns out the more you use your ears, the more you're exposed to even loud sounds, the better your hearing becomes. This woman quoted Poppy Cram of Dolby, quoted a paper showing that orchestral musicians who all their lives are exposed to sound pressure levels above 100 dB actually have, when they get old, they have better preserved hearing than people who live in quiet environments.
Oh my God, I find that very hard to believe.
It's very encouraging for those of us who
indeed. Well, being a musician myself and having played in plenty of orchestras and even rock bands in my day, that is very encouraging and somewhat surprising.
Yes, she quoted an example of a study that was done on these people in Mongolia who they are almost never subjected to sounds greater than 65 dBA. And at age 60, they have such terrible hearing loss compared to orchestra musicians who tend to be much better than the average American population when they're 60 in terms of hearing loss.
Wow.
So there you are. The example is if you live in a completely quiet environment, you're going to go deaf sooner.
Well, before we continue, we do have another sponsor for the show, which I'd like to take a moment to thank, and that is Ford. One of the latest technologies from Ford Sync and My Ford Touch is Wi-Fi connectivity. This feature can turn your car into a Wi-Fi hotspot, giving you and your passengers access to up to 5 devices at once. You simply establish your Wi-Fi connection by plugging the portable wireless access card from your wireless carrier into the USB port in the car. If you have a BlackBerry, you can use you can do it wirelessly with Bluetooth. And then you can connect up to 5 Wi-Fi-enabled devices to the hotspot using a secure password, and you're in. I mean, geez, what could be easier than that? Now you and your passengers can access music, browse the internet, download apps, play games via Wi-Fi. They can connect their laptops, tablets, mobile phones, other internet devices to the hotspot up to 5 at once, all without additional subscription or expense. Ford Sync with My Ford Touch featuring Wi-Fi connectivity is available in the 2012 Ford Focus. You can learn more about this and other technologies Ford is bringing to its vehicles at ford.com/technology. And as always, we thank Ford for their support of the TWIT network. So let's see. We were talking about... Oh, here, Beatmaster.
How reviewers have better hearing than normal people.
Yes, exactly. That's what we were talking about. Also, it brings up the issue that I think is pretty important, which is in doing testing, blind testing and such, you end up, I think that the experience of the listener has something to do with the outcome. You and I talked about this, I think, on the last time you were on the show, where you were testing cables. And I did want to just touch on cables because it's such a touchy subject after all. You and Michael Fremer engaged in a listening test at CES, I think, a few years ago, and you were more consistently able to determine which cable was which than the general public that was coming in and performing the test. And we attributed it at the time to the fact that you and Michael Fremer have a lot more experience. So this whole idea of creating internal maps may have something to do with that, eh?
It's possible. The other thing about that test, as I think we talked about, was we didn't know it was a test of cables. We thought it was a test of something more tangible. So our expectations were, we were more wide open to what our ears were telling us.
Which brings up another point you make in your lecture, which is the best blind test is the one in which the participant is not aware he's in a test.
Well, of course, because if you think about it, when you're in a test, you're in a different mental state than you are when you're just listening to music. So the better test methodology is going to be one where you don't know you're in a test. You're receptive to what your ears are telling you, just as you would be when you listen to a CD or LP in your system. And I quoted in the lecture an example, a test I took part in 4 years ago in London. It was a convention on high-resolution audio, high-resolution digital. And there's one room where Philip Hobbs, who does all the recordings for the Lin label and was a pioneer in high-res digital recording, had invited a number of people to come and listen to his new recordings. So in we all went. We sat down, and Philip started playing a recording of Handel's Messiah from the Dunedin Consort, which was, I think, a gramophone recording of the year a few years back. Anyway, we're all listening, and the sound starts off. It's an unfamiliar room, unfamiliar system. And the sound was very good. And then as the music progressed, I mean, it was I don't know if you know it, Scott. It's "For Unto Us a Boy is Born," which repeats the same refrain 3 times. So you have 4 pieces of music, basically, very similar. The second one, well, it didn't seem quite as good. The third one was definitely not as good, and the last one sounded terrible. And we're thinking, well, what is going on? Because how can the sound get worse as the music plays? Normally what happens is, as I said before, when you hit in the connection with the LP demagnetizing, sound gets better. The sound gets better the more you hear. So, except this was the opposite. What was going on? And, you know, Philip looked at the end of the music. Philip said, well, what do you think? And we all looked up and said, well, shuffled in our chairs a bit uncomfortably and said, well, we thought it was really good, but actually it sucks. And he said, and then he revealed he'd been subjecting us to a listening test without us knowing. We thought we were listening to music. Each time the refrain came along, "For unto us a child is born," he had degraded the sound. The first time through the refrain was 24-bit audio, 88.2 kilohertz sample rate. The second time was CD quality. The third time was Apple AAC at 320 kilobits per second. And the final time was MP3 at 192 kilobits per second. So I thought, boy, that is a beautiful test. First, we didn't know it was a test. Second, the way the changes were introduced worked with our ability to form models to throw into stark relief the degradation introduced by the throwing out of data. I thought it was a beautifully planned test. The only problem is that once, now I've explained it to you and everyone on the podcast can hear it, they can never experience it for themselves, like the flashing light test.
Right. Always a hazard of the trade here, I think, yeah. So one last question I want to ask you. We're almost out of time here. The issue of higher sampling rates, which this test brings up. You were listening to, the first time through the piece was, you said 24-bit, 88.2 kilohertz.
Yes.
You can get up to 192 kilohertz sampling rates,
That's
all
correct.
of which takes the maximum frequency that can be captured accurately up higher. And the more bits you use, the greater the dynamic range you can capture.
That's correct.
Now,
sorry.
I was gonna say humans can hear only up to about 20 kilohertz, and those of us who are older, not that high. Despite what you were saying earlier about hearing preservation. So, what is the advantage? Why do people say that that sounds better when you record at such high sampling rates?
Well, this again came out of the 2007 AES conference in London. The engineer Peter Craven, he is one of the smartest engineers on the planet. His passion is opera from the 1920s and before. So they're all on either Berliner discs or Edison cylinders. He found that if he captured the sound at 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit, which is the CD standard, it didn't sound as good as if he used a higher sample rate and greater bit depths, which is a paradox because the bandwidth of an Edison cylinder is only about, at best, 7 or 8 kilohertz. So 44.1 kilohertz is way overkill for sample rate. The dynamic range of a cylinder is actually pretty good. It's better than you'd expect, but it's still well below the 16-bit dynamic range. And he thought about, let's look at this situation in terms of the fact models. At the high sample rate and the greater bit depth, yes, it captured the sound of the opera singers and instruments as well, with no discernible advantage as CD Redbook's resolution and sample. But the noise of the shellac, the actual material the cylinder or disc is made from, floated more clear of the sounds of the instruments. In other words, it more accurately allowed the listener to create a model of the noise, recognize it as a noise, and discard it. And
in other words, sort of ignore it.
Yes, at the lower sample rate and resolution, theoretically good enough, the noise and the music were sort of smushed together. At the high
fused,
sample rate,
as it were.
Yes, at the high sample rate and the greater bit depth, the noise was reproduced more accurately, and as a result, could be discarded more easily by the listener. And I think a lot of that is going on with high sample rates. You're giving the ear more information it expects to create those internal models. It can create them more easily, more readily, with less fatigue.
Even though the information that you're giving it is theoretically beyond its capability to perceive.
Correct. It's just making everything easier for the ear and the brain.
Wow. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and some of your questions that remain, I think, with my audience. John Atkinson, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Scott. Really enjoyed it.
Good. You can contact John and get a lot of information about what he does and what he has done at Stereophile for the last 35 years, is it, or so, that you've been at Stereophile?
25 years at Stereophile and 10 years at Hi-Fi News Magazine before that.
Okay. Very good. Well, certainly an experienced listener, if ever there was one. You can go to stereophile.com and check out all of his writings. My online home, of course, is hometheater.com, a related website, both publications of Source Interlink. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Drew Major, the founder of Novell Networks, who is now working on IP delivery of TV for EchoStar, the former subsidiary or parent, I forget which, of Dish Network. So we're going to be talking a lot about IPTV, and that should be quite fascinating. So I hope you will join me for that. Until then, geek out.